Hi, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Jason Van Schie, and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. But before I introduce our guest and topic for today, allow me to introduce my co-host, Joelle Mitchell. How are you today, Joelle?
Jason, I've had two things happen to me that are work-related this week that I'd like to share with our listeners because I think it gives a good indication of the variety of experiences that I have while I'm at work here.
I'm a little bit worried. Should you be bringing this up with me first before our listeners?
I think you're aware.
The things that I did.
Well, So the first thing you didn't do. The first thing was I was invited to appear as a panelist at the conference coming up for the Australian Psychological Society College of Organisational Psychologists.
That's great. You are an influencer, so
apparently I am #influencer. So that's nice and rewarding and positive. And then as a contrast to that, I was measured against a 12-year-old child to see who was taller. Yeah.
And who was taller, Joelle?
It was unclear.
Well, according to the 12-year-old child, he was a lot bigger.
Well, by a mile, according to him. So I think he probably takes after his father in the way of exaggeration.
Yeah, or accuracy. Yeah, wise kid, I reckon. Yeah, if he takes after his dad. So, yeah, in case the listeners aren't aware, my 12-year-old son is huge and Joelle is tiny. And yep.
Well, Jason's also very tall, so I think we can probably say that he may not be an average 12-year-old height.
Yeah, probably not.
If that can make me feel any, I shouldn't have to feel bad because I'm short. I am as I am.
No, we accept you as you are, Joelle. So yeah, we know that you're not going to grow another foot and be average size anytime soon. So.
No.
Yeah. That's great. Well, no, look, let's not talk any further about height or lack of. Let's introduce our guest. So she has more than 20 years of experience working in the mental health, substance abuse and health and social care fields. She actually developed the first UK levy-funded workplace mental health leadership development apprenticeship program as well. This person is the co-founder and managing director of Our Minds Work. Welcome to the podcast, Emily Pearson.
Hello, good morning and good evening for you both.
Yeah, there is a little bit of time zone difference. Yeah, so glad we could make the calendars work and for you to join us via the magic of the internet.
Yes, definitely. And I'll add something that was quite joyous about getting up that little bit earlier this morning is I managed to actually hear, when I let the cats in first thing this morning, the dawn chorus. So that was a pretty kind of a magnificent moment because I don't normally get to hear it that early. So thanks for getting me out of bed a little bit earlier this morning. I really enjoyed hearing the birds singing away. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and in fact, wasn't that the focus of Mental Health Week as well, about nature and the benefits for mental well-being? So glad you got a bit of that this morning. So there's one positive to come out of the early morning start.
Indeed. Yeah. Indeed. Here in Australia, the dawn chorus often consists of crows, which is not that pleasant to hear. All right. Well, let's get started. Can you tell us what podcasts you like to listen to?
So I have two favorites, really. One of my most favorites that I listen to on probably a weekly basis when they release new ones is a couple of evolutionary biologists called Brett Weinstein and Heather Hayen. You may have heard of them. They're from America. They're not UK based, but they are so interesting. Very reasonable people. They obviously have a lot of knowledge in understanding evolutionary psychology and biology. So I really get a lot from listening to their perspective and understanding how we can use some of the things that they understand in how we evolve and ecosystems, and then actually start to think about how we can relate that back into the workplace. And the other podcast that I listen to regularly as well is a guy called Sam Harris, another American podcaster, philosopher, again, one of the most reasonable people I've ever heard actually talk about, some of the most divisive topics and dividing topics that we probably have around at the moment as well. So they're two of my main podcasts that I listen to.
Fantastic. I don't think any of our guests have come up with those ones before. So
no, I've made a note of them.
Yep, some new ones for the listeners there. Fantastic. All right. Well, can you tell us all about your professional career then?
Gosh, yes. So let's do 20 years in 60 seconds. So my career in health and social care really started after my own lived experience of severe mental illness. I'd always had an interest in people and helping people, and my very first job working in health and social care was with adults with learning difficulties and dementia. So I was always very interested in psychology, in kind of mental health. But when I became unwell, obviously, I wasn't able to do very much. I had become so unwell, I was unable to function normally. Couldn't work, some days couldn't get out of bed. I was diagnosed with a range of mental health problems, clinical depression, anxiety, panic disorder, anorexia. It's like a game of bingo being sat in the doctors. But to me, those diagnoses weren't always helpful for me. I think what I realise now, after decades and decades of learning about myself and mental health, is I was just unwell. And when I look back at the reasons why, there were, significant traumas and challenges throughout my teenage years. So I didn't feel as if I had these labels and diagnoses, that actually some of those diagnoses can be very, very difficult to be told that you're never going to recover from them. You're always going to have them. Especially, depression 20 years ago was thought that it was something that you would continuously have, and you would only be well if you took medication for them. So we understand mental health very, very differently now. I worked with young people in care, insecure, in the communities, in looked after care for around about 10, 12 years before I actually decided that, I'd learned a significant amount working with young people, and I wanted to look at training to be a health and social care trainer. So that was the angle I then started to take, was looking at how I could use what I'd learned and start to train other people in the experience and knowledge that I'd had. So I did my time working from young people into adult care, which kind of brings us up to the workplace. So I then had the opportunity to work with Mind. So Mind is the biggest mental health charity in England. And I had an amazing opportunity to work on really the first workplace mental health culture change program, which ran about it'd be coming up to 5-6 years ago now. And this was called the Blue Light Programme. And I was part of an amazing team who actually designed and delivered a culture change framework of training, implementing a range of initiatives in the workplace, getting senior leaders on board to really lead the culture change. So all the things that we talk about now, this really was an innovative way of actually bringing in these culture change programs. And up in the Northeast, I managed and led the Northeast Network. So that was where we delivered into the 6 local emergency services. We had, out of all the 6 pilots, the most successful pilot, the thirst and passion in the Northeast to really implement, these products and services that we designed was just phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. And they're still ongoing now, not just up here in the Northeast, but many of the pilots and many of the minds across the UK now continue to deliver the Blue Light Programme. So, it's completely embedded into workplace practice and culture. And that was always, and that still is always, where we want to get to when we're talking about culture change in the workplace. So that was really my first experience, bringing all of what I'd learned and all my qualifications and knowledge into understanding mental health in the workplace. And I keep talking about environments because this really is part of the Our Minds Work model of understanding workplaces. We talk about workplaces as an ecosystem, and how an ecosystem can be very fragile, to things like change. But we also understand what a flourishing ecosystem looks like, and as humans, that's generally what we're constantly trying to achieve, and we probably understand how to do that better in the world of, you know, the trees, the sun, and our real life nature ecosystems that we just started talking about there. And if them birds weren't singing this morning, that would tell me that my ecosystem either didn't have any birds in it, which would probably mean I'm maybe sat in a city somewhere, or if I was out in nature like I am here, that would be a real worry to me. So we like to think about the workplace as an ecosystem in this way, and how all the different parts actually come together to create a healthy, thriving ecosystem, which we want to create. So that's kind of where I'm at now. And once I left working for Mind, I set up Our Minds Work with a couple of co-founders. Sorry, excuse me. And our mission really is to create mentally healthy workplaces that thrive by implementing our culture change model. So we've actually created our own framework of culture change in a specific order, and we support workplaces to actually implement this culture change to help them to move from an ecosystem that may be at risk. So actually an ecosystem that causes psychological injuries, aren't even legally compliant when it comes to things like work-related stress and following the HSE legislation, all the way through to what we call inspiring culture. And that really is where that culture is so embedded. It's just part of daily practice. It's part of the way that you think about your workplace as an ecosystem, and you're constantly evaluating it. You're constantly collaborating together for better outcomes, and you're constantly trying to empower and encourage people to take ownership for their own mental health, but also for the changes to create a mentally healthy workplace. So that eco model, which I've just mentioned there, is about evaluation, collaboration, and ownership, all really fits into how we look to understand the world of the workplace as an ecosystem. And one of the reasons why I like to think about it that way is because my very first job working in the training centre for young people, you can just imagine what that environment was like. You can just imagine what that ecosystem was like. It was a really, really difficult place to work, and it was a very, very difficult place for young people to be in, away from the family, away from the friends, cat C prison, officers walking around, restraints a lot of the time, struggling with mental health problems. It was the complete opposite of what we want to achieve in a workplace. So I've seen what it looks like when it's not going very well. So what we want to be able to do is to achieve something, where we can all have access to support when we need it, so that we're able to thrive.
That was a little longer than 60 seconds.
Sorry.
It was a very thorough overview, but very, very good to understand the journey, I guess, from your own lived experience to some of your early professional experiences assisting people who were in a similar position or worse than what you were, and how you've now translated that into more of a corporate environment. So I am interested in Our Minds Work, and you talked about this ecosystem. But what are some of the specific deliverables that you provide to organisations who engage your services?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the things that we don't do is we don't do tick boxes. So we have designed our own culture.
But I found companies really like tick boxes. So
yes, they do. So they tend not to be our clients. Great way of filtering them out, really. I think so. And somebody said to me the other day, I bet you're really busy during Mental Health Awareness Week, and we are no busier than we are any other time, because the clients that we work with them over years and years and years, and we actually train people to run their own campaigns. So, you know, we don't get people messaging us going, can you just come in and do an hour's talk because it's Mental Health Awareness Week? And actually, if we did have that, we would be saying, well, do you have this in place first? You know, if somebody comes out of this session and says, I'm struggling, where do we send them for help? Do your managers know how to support that person? So we generally get to the point where it's like, maybe this isn't the right time for you, and we're not the right company to deliver a tick box exercise.
You said good on you for, you know, not taking those clients on board who don't want to do it properly.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, very interesting. So what we're wanting to talk to you about today is the mental health first aid component of that, and probably more broadly looking at the way that, you know, the way that organisations commonly use mental health first aid, and maybe some of the issues that might be associated with that. So to sort of lead into that, do you have some observations about how mental health first aid is typically implemented in organisations?
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about mental health first aid, it's a bit of an umbrella term, because there are many different products when it comes to mental health first aid. Some of them are accredited, some of them are not accredited. You know, there's a range of organisations actually delivering what we call mental health first style initiatives. So I think when we think about a starting point, I like to explain things visually. And the way that I like to think about it is, mental health first aid is generally known as a 2-day training course that is probably more based on mental health awareness, rather than, you know, really building skills and behaviours in somebody to become a person in a specific role. So if you've just put people on this mental health first aid 2-day training course, and you're now saying you're a mental health first aider and you have a specific role, expectations, responsibilities, but you don't do all of the things that's needed to do to safely implement that, it's a bit like saying, so we're going to start up a peer-to-peer support service. We're going to call them mental health first aiders. They're there to provide, you know, mental health listening and signposting to colleagues. And okay, great, you've gone on your 2-day training. Now what do you do? The way that I like to visually represent this is, imagine you've trained 50 to 100 people on this training course, and some of the people with companies we come across, you know, even exceed that in a workplace. And they're all stood in the car park, and it's raining and the wind's blowing. These people are stood there. People are walking past them going, what are they stood there for? I'm not quite sure what they're supposed to be doing, you know, not paying any attention. That's a bit weird, you know, I don't understand why they're there. These people are not protected by anything. Nobody knows what they're doing. So we can think about mental health first aid trained people as they've just been on a 2-day training course, but they're there with an expectation to provide a service for their colleagues, but without any of the infrastructure and guidance and support and protection to be able to do that safely. So that's where a lot of organizations kind of start and stop. That for a lot of organizations is just they put people on training and they expect it to just run itself. There are then different levels of how far companies go with regards to getting to a place where, for us, when we talk about our blueprint, so we spent around about 6 months actually designing a very comprehensive blueprint that covers the steps, all the steps required to implement a safe service, because that's what we're doing. We're training people in a role to provide a service for their colleagues. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's obviously, that's, sorry to cut you off, Emily, and that's obviously really important to do that. So I'm interested, you know, what is the lived experience then like for mental health first aiders, and why do they need this additional support?
Yeah, so when we think about providing a service for people, there is a range of risks, not just for the mental health first aiders, but for any of the colleagues who they are there to support or provide a service to, and for the business as well. Yeah, there are risks for everybody here. And one of the ways of implementing a safe service has to be around safe recruitment. And if you think about creating a service, any other service, not mental health first aid service, let's say, I don't know, it was a service that that sold, I don't know, plants to people. You know, you would have to recruit these people. You would have to train them correctly to do the job that they're expected to do. They would have regular supervision, not supervision, but I use the term supervision. They would have regular one-to-ones to check in, you know, how's the job going? Do you need any additional support? You know, has there been any problems? You know, reviewing and monitoring that service. We would do that with any service ever. But what's happened is I don't think mental health first aid has been marketed in the right way. So we have this level of expectation, which is much higher in comparison to what the training actually delivers. Yeah. So it's all of this other stuff that needs to be wrapped around to safeguard people. Yeah. Safeguard people, not just mental health first aid. This is everybody. But when it comes to lived experience, one of the things that we do understand is generally people like myself have had a lived experience, and then we want to help people. You know, we want to be able to use that experience to help other people. There's a couple of things around this. Is one of the issues around recruitment around mental health first aiders has generally just been, who wants to be a mental health first aider? People put their hands up and they go along to the training without really understanding the kind of complexities and the really importance of the role and the responsibilities that's expected of them. So that in itself can be very, very difficult for people if you've got a lived experience and you're not prepared for some of the conversations that you might now get into. There's no triage, there's no protective barrier. That person maybe doesn't know how to deal confidently with a situation where they're in, where actually they're having a conversation about something that might be triggering some of their past trauma. So when we come to kind of safeguarding people, it includes one element of safeguarding people who potentially have a lived experience. So keeping to that thread, our blueprint, we sat and really thought about this. And, you know, I was part of setting up a counselling service for a local mind. And I know what you need to do to set up a counselling service. You know, there is a lot of safeguards, policies and procedures, infrastructure in place to safeguard not just the, you know, the patients and the clients, but also the counsellors, the people who are therapists and the people who have more knowledge and understanding around mental ill health and safeguarding than anyone. And one of the ways that this is done is kind of through a triage process and through understanding who your counsellors are. So, for example, a triage process helps us to figure out, you know, why is this client coming for support? If that client is coming to talk about domestic violence and abuse, you are not going to match them with your therapist who has said, look, I don't do domestic violence and abuse. It's too close. It's too raw for me. But in the workplace, when we say, come and talk to us about mental health, you are opening the door to people coming and talking about anything connected to our mental health. And there is no triage, there's no safeguards in place. So one of the ways that we work with organisations to implement this part of safeguarding people around kind of preventing vicarious trauma and re-triggering people into potential relapses is we say there's a couple of things. One of the things is about how you market the service. So we talk about So remember all those people out in the car park? We talk about our infrastructure, and Blueprint is actually about creating them a lovely building. It's got a roof on it, which means it's protected from policies, procedures, guidance on actually how to function this service, how to review it, how to keep it safe. It has lovely windows that are transparent, so you can actually see into the service. You know exactly what them people are there for. You know exactly what confidentiality means. You know exactly that somebody can breach confidentiality if there's a safeguarding risk. You know, a lot of organisations don't have safeguarding policies and procedures in place or trained in understanding what this means, yet they'll have, you know, hundreds of mental health first aiders kind of walking around, either potentially missing safeguarding opportunities, or there is a potential greater risk that, you know, if it's what the worst that can happen, a life is lost due to the risk of suicide and it hasn't been managed appropriately. So this is a really important part of creating this safe environment for your mental health first aiders, or we like to call them mental health advocates, because it's more of an advocate role the way we train them. You know, this really is about providing the safety for them to practice safely. So they're providing the service safely for them, as well as for the people who they're going to be potentially, you know, listening to. So one of the ways is about your access points. How do people access your service? So we talk about access points as the less number of access points you have, the more you can safeguard it, the more you can triage it. So for example, we'll generally say you should really have 2 access points. An access point should be, you know, kind of face to face. You've bumped into somebody, you know, over the water cooler, and you've just said, oh, you know, I've had a really difficult time this morning. Are you free for a chat? But part of that safeguarding for that mental health first aider has to be the confidence of saying, you know, straight away, so, you know, I'm here to talk to you today. This service is confidential. Unless you tell me something that puts you or somebody else at risk of significant harm, then I'll have to follow our policy and procedure to make sure that people are kept safe. What is it specifically that you want to talk about today? And if that person then says a topic like, I've just, you know, had a bereavement, and you're a mental health first aider sat there who only had a bereavement 3 months ago, they need to be comfortable and confident in saying, I'm definitely not the right person to speak to you today, but let me find somebody that is.
Yeah.
Because we would do that in therapy services. We would have those layers of safeguarding in place, because you could potentially re-trigger somebody through relapse and vicarious trauma that way.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that sounds very sensible. And yeah, you can understand why there needs to be a lot more thought put around mental health first aid, rather than just like being your first port of call. Oh, let's get, you know, 10 volunteers to go on the course and then we're kind of done. So yeah, really good that you're providing that extra level of safeguarding for those people.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think you've outlined fairly well there some of the hazards that you can experience when you are a mental health first aider if it's not if those protections aren't actually established by the organisation. Do you think that organisations have an appreciation of that, or is it something that they need a lot of educating about?
One of our employees who's actually doing an apprenticeship at the moment, they did this really great activity, which I think is a really great way of showing this. They were all asked to make a paper hat without any direction or guidance. So they're all making these paper hats. Some of them are really terrible and falling off people's heads. You know, some of them were all right, but they all looked very, very different. Afterwards, they then gave them the guidance and said, okay, follow this guidance and make your paper hat. Everybody's paper hat was the same. It all stayed on their heads, and it actually looked wonderful as well. And I think this is a really great way of saying, a really great way of showing people that you only know what you know. And when it comes to mental health, there is nobody in a workplace who has qualifications, experience, you know, even understanding the implications of some of the policies and procedures that they're expected to have in place. There's nobody generally in a workplace who has that level of knowledge and experience who could actually implement something like that in a very safe and comprehensive way. Sorry. So that's why we created this blueprint, because now we can say, look, we're here to help you. We have this blueprint. We'll support you through all of the steps, so that when you get to the point where people are actually connecting with their colleagues, you can sleep at night. You know that it's been done safely. There's regular support being put into place. People have been developed. They've got guidance on how to manage situations. Everybody knows what the infrastructure is. If X happens, do Y. And without all of that, I honestly, even I didn't sleep, knowing that people weren't doing these things. And this is what really triggered us to create our own blueprint, because some of the guidance that we were seeing being provided on implementation of mental health first aid style initiatives was frightening. I remember reading one literally just about a month before we released ours. It took us about 6 months to write ours, and as you can see, it is in extremely depth. I mean, I've just told you about one tiny little part of that there, and this element in the guidance said, if you are concerned about somebody's risk level when it comes to their mental health, tell someone. And I read that and I went, tell who? Who are we telling? It's almost like, no, these companies are not taking responsibility actually for what they're implementing. They've created this product and marketed it in a specific way, but then they're not willing to take responsibility for, if you are going to do this, this is like really, the back end of what you need to be implementing. And I'm not 100% certain why, whether it's a lack of knowledge by these people who are implementing it, or if it's a lack of, it then doesn't become a tick box exercise, does it? It becomes much harder to do. And I think that's why we have this ethical approach. It's not our best-selling service, because it's hard to do and it takes much more investment. But when it's done, it's implemented. And the way that I like to explain it on much wider terms is, a lot of organizations are not just in the UK, they're actually global, or they have mental health first aid style initiatives and mental health first aid trained people across a number of units in the UK. And if you think about McDonald's, everybody knows McDonald's. McDonald's has a blueprint. So no matter where you are in the world, you go into McDonald's, it's exactly the same. It looks the same, it feels the same, the policies, the procedures, the building's the same. That is their blueprint. Yeah. That's what our blueprint does. So then it doesn't matter where your mental health first aiders are in the world, in the UK, they're all following the same blueprint. That's the beauty of this type of infrastructure. Or you have hundreds of mental health first aid trained people without that. So you're back into the car park, people stood in the rain, people walking past them. People are not doing what they're not comfortable to do, what they're expected to do. So, it is a huge part of creating a mentally healthy workplace. But like you say, it is a part of a strategy. So if you are going to the part where you're just training mental health first aiders without all of that other stuff, you're creating a bigger risk than having none at all.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point, because we talk a lot about risk management on this show, given it's a psych health and safety podcast. And one of the fundamentals of risk management is being aware that when you bring in a control to mitigate a hazard, that you're aware that you might be bringing in an additional risk. And so often I think organizations bring in mental health first aid training because they think that they're addressing the risk of poor mental health. But what they're doing, as we've been talking about in this episode, is, well, now you're putting another group of people at risk because you don't have the supports or the controls to manage the risk that they're exposed to.
Yeah, it's almost like bringing a subcontractor in to do your high high hazard work, and yeah, your workforce is protected, but we won't worry about the contractor that's actually putting themselves at risk.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's a fundamental thing that I think organisations need to understand, and I think you're doing important work. And so, actually, on that, you talked a bit about, I guess, over the last close to hour now, you've talked about, your progression from someone with lived experience to a real interest in working with people who have their own experiences of mental health problems. And now also then how you are providing further support for companies who want to create, I guess, safe mental health first aid in particular kind of programs or peer support programs, safeguarding these people. So looking into the future, into your crystal ball, what are your hopes for the future of workplace mental health?
So I think where we are now, and this is always really interesting because I look at how far have we come, and especially in the UK, when mental health in the workplace started to become a thing, we called it a movement. Any movement has progression and should be shown kind of measurable outcomes. And I'm still struggling to see some of those. Obviously, I think we really are just scratching the surface when it comes to mental health in the workplace. What we have done is really started to reduce stigma and build people's awareness. That's really what we've done over the past 5 to 6 years, definitely. We haven't seen any of the statistics coming down yet, specifically when it comes to work-related stress in the UK. The latest statistics before the pandemic happened, we saw the highest level of reported work-related stress, anxiety and depression than we have since HSE started to collect that data 18 years ago. And it had gone from a steady incline to this, really strong peak. So, this is also a reasonable thing to happen. When you do raise awareness and reduce stigma, you do see a peak. You'll see a peak in sickness absence, people reporting that actually it's not a cold, it is a anxiety, or I'm experiencing stress. So that is reasonable to expect that. And I think that just shows how early on we are when it comes to mental health in the workplace, because we're still seeing that spike. We're not starting to see it come down yet. There are certain things for me that there is an issue around. We're not evidencing certain things. So when we think about, again, mental health first aid style initiatives, in the UK, we've probably got somewhere like over 800,000 people who have been trained in some form of like mental health first aid. And when you look at suicide rates in the UK, we're up to about 6,000 a year. For every one suicide, there's about 20 attempts. So that, bumps the statistics up to somewhere around like 250,000 attempts every year. And then add to that the people who are thinking about suicide but actually not going as far as attempting it. We're talking about a lot of people. So if we have over 800,000 mental health first aiders in the workplace who are there specifically to support people in these moments, these conversations are happening in a workplace. They're not being recorded. They're not being reported because the legislation hasn't caught up to what we're actually creating in this workplace. It's a brand new market. Yeah, we know that. We wouldn't have been sat here having this conversation 6 years ago. So we've created this new arena that isn't being monitored. It doesn't have legislation to protect it. That we've just had mental health first aid for the second time to be brought into the House of Commons. Sorry, that's me talking too much, isn't it? They had tried to pass it as a legal obligation for employers, but it's failed again, and the reasons why it's failed are just some of the reasons what we're talking about here today. When you think about physical first aid, there is legislation, there are reporting mechanisms. People, if you send somebody to, A&E, you've got to actually sit down and write a report, and it's monitored and it's reviewed. And when it comes to mental health first aid, where someone's at risk of suicide, people don't have safeguarding policies and procedures in place, or even critical incident forms that should be filled in when these things are happening. So I think there's a lot going on in the workplace that we just don't know about because it's not being reported. No one's monitoring it. So, I think we are just at the beginning. For my crystal ball, for one of our major goals when it comes to creating mentally healthy workplaces is, in over the next kind of 10 years, 5 to 10 years, what we want to see is that workplaces actually invest in significant, comprehensive leadership and management training for creating mentally healthy workplaces for culture change, because that's what we're missing. We're still at the education piece and the reducing stigma bit. What we're trying to do through the design of our level 4 diploma, which is mapped over to an apprenticeship standard, is we can now actually use this. We can bring together apprenticeships and mental health, workplace mental health expertise, and bring them together so that it's a comprehensive level of skills and knowledge and behaviors and tools that are a part of a leadership development program, so that everybody in a workplace, from your frontline managers all the way up to your senior leaders and key people whose responsibility it's generally given to, like HR professionals, to lead these culture change models, that they have much more than just a one-day awareness course. This really is about behavior change. That's where I would like to get to. And I think if we can do this, we'll definitely start to see work-related stress, anxiety, and depression coming down, because you will have implemented the full policy, procedure, ongoing monitoring, auditing, stress risk assessments, preventatively, early intervention. It will be doing everything possible to prevent work-related stress from happening. Where it does happen, that it's intervened much earlier, rather than what's happening now is people don't know about the legislation. They don't know, never even heard of a stress risk assessment. They're not being used, and people just get sent to Ocky Health if they've gone on the sick with work-related stress, because nobody knows how to deal with it in the workplace. So yeah, for me, I want to see that real culture change piece that will impact the economy in the UK. But the impact of the economy means it's impacting the people, because the people are our economy. They are our biggest asset in the UK.
Yeah, for sure.
So do you have some parting words of advice for professionals who are aspiring to work in this field of workplace psychological health and safety?
Yes. Do it properly. I think there is, we have seen, because the workplace mental health field isn't regulated, there are a lot of people out there who have seen an opportunity to make money. I'm not saying that it's being done with bad will, but like I said, you only know what you know. So you may think that you're doing a great thing, where actually you may be creating additional risks for companies as well. So I think it's really important that if this is what you want to work in, that you get the right qualifications, you do the right training. Working with people with mental health problems in recovery overrides for me any of my training and qualifications. Because what you can learn, I like to use this as an example, when we look at the criteria in the DSM for clinical depression, it's very, very specific. There's 9 specific symptoms that you are going to fit into this little box, no tests or anything to say that that's what it is. And we kind of think that everybody who has depression is going to fit into this box. But when you've actually worked with people with mental health problems through recovery, you can have 100 people in the same room who've all had a diagnosis of clinical depression, will all experience it differently. All of their stories will be very, very different, very, very complex. And I think when you have not experienced that real life of supporting people through these difficult times, I'm not quite sure how you then go into workplaces and train just based on, you know, a 5-day training course about all the signs and symptoms of all the little labels you can put people into a box for. So, you know, I think it's about protecting people. Safeguarding people is our priority. And I think also for us, it's about being an ethical business. You know, if we can't go in and work ethically and safeguard an organisation through our interventions, then we shouldn't be doing it. And I think that really is, for me, my advice is, if you want to work in this field where we're significantly trying to impact people who are potentially vulnerable, have mental illness, maybe at risk of suicide, we need to be doing this properly. There is no room for error and things to go wrong in this field. So I think that would be my advice.
Good advice. Thank you, Emily.
Yeah, Emily, it's been a great conversation. We really wanted to talk about, I guess, mental health first aid and the, I guess, psych hazards associated with that. And I guess there's no one better than someone who actually has, you know, experience in delivering the course, but also, like yourself, actually building the controls that organisations can implement to, as you say, safeguard those people who are put in that position to provide that peer support.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's exactly what it should be about. Safeguarding should be the first thing that we think about before we implement any type of mental health initiative in the workplace.
Yeah. So, look, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Glad we could finally get it after, I think it was a few months trying to schedule this one in. So great to have you on. All the best with your work. Where can people find out more about Our Minds Work?
So on our website, which is ourmindswork.com, and a LinkedIn as well. If you can find our page on LinkedIn, it's just Our Minds Work with an apostrophe S on Minds. We post a lot on LinkedIn as well.
Terrific. Yeah. So thanks so much, Emily. So listeners, that brings us to the end of the show today. Talking about LinkedIn, you know, Joelle and I and the Psych Health and Safety podcast are very active as well. So feel free to reach out to us or follow us over LinkedIn. We also record all these conversations that we have over the Zoom that we use, and we publish them on the Flourish DX YouTube channel. So feel free to check out the video if you prefer that. Also, we do the short form videos that we publish on the Flourish DX LinkedIn page. So that's it for this episode, listeners. We'll catch you next time.